Alright, so today we're going to take a look at probably my new favorite lens, and that is the 70-200 f2.8 G Master lens from Sony. This is the version 2. I can't even explain how much this lens is already blowing me away. Alright, so let's just get in to start talking about this lens. Let's talk about some specs. Let's talk about the differences between the version 1 and version 2. Of course, we're going to show lots of samples, some video, some photos. I took this thing along to New York when we did a long street photography shoot, and I did a lot of street photography with this lens. I did a lot of video with this lens. I did some B-roll with this lens. I can't even explain to you how much I didn't want to take this off my camera almost the whole time we were there. All right, so let's get into some specs on this lens. This is a 70-200 millimeter lens. It's an f2.8. It's a constant f2.8. And it goes all the way up to an f22. So this is an 11 blade aperture, which is going to give you some crazy blurred background, some bokeh. This thing is quite a bit lighter than the old version, which is really nice. So this thing comes in at 2.3 pounds, which is not a light lens, but for a lens like this, it's actually fairly light. So what you get with this lens is a nice little zip up bag. You get the lens hood, which unlike the old model is a fixed circle lens. It's not a cutouts on the side. So you can set this thing down on the ground and it's not going to tip over. Plus it's a rubber bottom, so you're not going to scar up stuff, and it's going to have kind of a good grip if you set it down on something. So that is really cool that it has that. On the bottom of the lens hood, you still have the door, so you can get into a variable ND filter or some kind of filter in there. Keep in mind, if you are using filters with the hood, you do need to use the 77mm thread, which is what the lens is. You can't use any step-up rings or anything like that with the hood on. You can use that obviously if the hood's off. All right, so let's take a look at the features that come on the lens itself. Right away, you'll notice at the top here that it has an aperture ring now. Just like all the other newer Sony lenses, they're putting aperture rings on here so that you can change your aperture on the fly without having to use your camera dials. That's a pretty cool feature. Moving down to the bottom, there is an iris lock, so if you do want to lock the aperture on the ring so you can't move it, you can do that now. So moving up to the buttons here, you have a mode for stabilization. You have 3 modes of stabilization. You have mode 1, which is kind of a general stabilization. Mode 2, which is supposed to be for panning. And then you have mode 3 stabilization, which is kind of just a randomized stabilization. There's really no rhyme or reason. So I kind of pretty much use 1 or 3 specifically because I don't do a lot of panning stuff. But pretty much most of the time, I'm just sitting in 1. And then moving up the switches here, you have the OSS off and on switch, so you can turn off stabilization if you actually want to do that. All right, so moving up the switches here, you have the ability to change it from, I want to tell the camera from 3 meters on to focus, or you can switch it to have it go from close range focal distance from 15 inches all the way to infinity. Above that, you can turn off or turn on the DMF. I pretty much just keep mine off all the time. And then at the top, you have your autofocus, manual focus switch itself. Moving to the other side, you do have the ability to turn the click off or on the aperture ring itself. So if you're a video shooter and you want to not have those haptic feedbacks, you can turn that off and then it rolls smoothly. If you're using photography, you're probably just going to leave that on because you want that actual feedback. So then looking at this lens here, you have a custom button on the side, you have a custom button on the top, and then you have a custom button on the bottom. So the one thing that I didn't like about this when we were shooting this in New York, this bottom one was somehow defaulted to turn off and on my manual focus. So I actually turned that off because I kept bumping it. Wasn't a big fan of that switch. But anyways, you have 3 custom buttons if you choose to have that. I personally don't like that bottom one. And then moving back over to the side here, you'll see that it has a little lock wheel. This is so that you can turn your tripod foot. The one thing that I would like to see Sony do with these though, is that when you get to these little points where it tells you it's upright or if it's on the side, I kind of wish they put a little groove in there so that when you would get some kind of haptic feedback as you pass over those. So you don't have to like look every time to guess, but those are there, you can move that. And then on the bottom, if you choose to, you can loosen this knob and actually just take this whole foot off. So if you hate this thing and you're annoyed of it, you can take it off, get rid of it. But personally, when I was shooting a lot of the street photos, I actually just turned it up so that it was on top so I could get my hand underneath. So looking at the lens hood, there is a lock for the lens hood, like I said before. Let's take that off here now. So the one thing that I really enjoyed about this lens is that the zoom range dial is actually the back dial and the focus dial is the front. And then the really cool thing about this lens is that to go from 70 to 200, it's about a 1-inch throw. It is really short. So what I usually do when I'm holding this lens is I kind of have my hand directly under the bottom of the lens. I have my thumb on the side by the G Master logo, And then I put my forefinger on the focus ring, so that way you can literally move your thumb and change the zoom from 70 to 200. It's really easy to move. And then when you're in manual focus, being that you have your forefinger on the focus lens, it's really easy to just move that focus ring with your forefinger while keeping the lens sturdy if you're hand holding it. So I really like the setup of this. It's very ergonomic, and it's really nice. Some lenses you have to like turn all the way to get the zoom out. I love that this doesn't do that. So if you're wondering if you should buy the version 1 or the version 2, let me just kind of tell you some of the differences here. So obviously the lens hood has changed a little bit. It does not have the cutouts on the side, so you do have a full base to kind of set this lens down on, and it's not going to tip over. You do have the aperture ring itself, but one of the big differences that you're going to notice right away is that this is a pound lighter than the other one. This comes in at 2.3 pounds, which is about 1,000 grams, and the version 1 comes in at 3.2 pounds, which is like 1,400 grams, something like that. That's a noticeable difference when you're carrying around a lens all day long, 1 pound. That is probably one of the biggest dramatic differences between these two lenses, other than the autofocus. The version 1 of this lens definitely did struggle with speed of autofocus, but this thing absolutely crushes that. This focused so dang fast on people, it was crazy. In fact, let's just show a couple examples here. When we were shooting in New York, I actually made a couple jokes about just lifting the camera, not looking, just hitting the shutter button and just taking what it takes. And then when I looked back at those photos, they looked great. It immediately tracked onto the eye focus. It snapped the portrait of the person that was standing right in front of me without even me looking at the camera. It actually did get a pretty good composition here, but I was just absolutely blown away how quick this thing could just nail autofocus. Like, you would lift up the camera for something like really quick that's coming at you. Basically, as you're clicking the button down, it's already focused. Lightning fast with this thing. So there is some talk about the Sony A1 about its ability to shoot like 30 frames per second in photo burst mode. From what I heard from other people who shoot with the A1 and this lens, they have no problems getting 30 frames a second with this thing, with maybe 1, maybe 2 frames dropped of focus, but otherwise just flawless lens for burst mode. So, because that's one thing about burst mode, is if you're just going to pull that trigger and just take 30 frames, you want something that's going to be very lightning fast for focus, and 100% this is that lens. So anyways, when we were in New York doing some street photography, a lot of times I was running like my Sigma 24-70, but then there'd be all these times where I'm like, I wish I had this lens on. So after I put this lens on, we were in Times Square, so I was pretty much just pointing it at people who were posing for photos. As you can see here in some of these photos here, they just looked awesome. I was shooting everything at f2.8 at night. That background blur is incredible. Most of the time you can't even tell what's going on behind it because they are just big light up billboards. But even sometimes in the daytime here, this background blur on this thing is so good. I love how well this looks. It was really tough to want to go back to my other lenses after shooting this. But while you're in New York, obviously you do need to have some wide angle shots. So clearly I had to take this thing off every now and then to get some of those wide shots, but this lens is a dream for doing kind of zoomed in, real personal portrait style street photography. And just having the ability to have that much separation between the background and your subject that you're shooting just really brings these photos alive. But it's not just photography that's really good with this lens. This lens does do very well with video. So I was shooting this lens with the A7S III. It was getting just incredible shots. I love how much this thing gets background separation. You get these really dreamy looks, especially if you're shooting in like 120 frames a second. It was incredibly good looking with this lens. Where this lens really succeeds though is when you have a lot of depth behind a person or a subject, so then you get that insane amount of background blur or bokeh. So let me show you a couple other shots that we shot with this thing in video. Like I said, we were in New York doing street photography. I was with Curtis Padley. If you guys haven't checked out his channel, he does some insane POV photo shoot stuff. So check his stuff out. There'll be a link in the description. So while he was shooting his videos, doing his photography stuff, I was doing a lot of the B-roll for him. And we had the sunset that was going down. That was just absolutely incredible. So what I did is I actually took this lens hood completely off the camera and I just started filming him. I wanted the sun to just come blaring into this lens. I really wanted to see how well this lens handled just direct sunlight straight into it. We were getting some pretty cool shots here where the sun was wrapping around the subject. It was on the horizon. You could see the light coming through the dead cat on top of the lens. It was just some really dreamy, almost looks like we're in California kind of look. But that was some of my favorite shots I think I've ever done on that camera, let alone with this lens. I did have to step back quite a ways because I zoomed all the way to 200 because this thing does get, I think, a little bit more bokeh in the background when you are at 200, more so than when you're at 70. But that compression that this thing does at 200 is why I like this lens as much too. It just looks so good when you're doing these shots. I really wanted to start doing more product photography where I was setting stuff down in the street. Like I set down this Peter McKinnon bag in the street. We walked way back and I zoomed in and got some really good background blur. In fact, I think I might have actually jumped up to like a 3.5 to let some of the city show through because I didn't want to make it completely unrecognizable. But yeah, this lens makes me want to do more product photography with this from a distance. So then, mentioning product video and product photography, what's really nice about this one is it has a minimum focus distance of about like a foot, was it 1.3, yeah, 1.32 feet. So you can get relatively close to your subject and it's gonna stay in focus. I've used some other lenses before where you have to have like 3 to 4 feet away from a subject before it has minimum focus distance. So having that 1.32 feet is pretty nice with this lens. All right, so let's talk about price on this guy here. This thing comes in at $2,800 USD. It is not a cheap lens. I would not recommend buying this lens if you do not make money doing photography or video. If you're doing this as a hobby, this is kind of an expensive purchase unless you really just don't want to, you don't care about how much money you're spending on a hobby. But if you are doing like professional photography or video, whether you're doing sports photography or outdoor photography, wildlife, this is going to be a really good lens for you. There's a reason why pretty much a lot of the people who sit on the courts of NBA use this lens with Sony cameras because it is fast and it takes amazing photos. So if you've been on the fence about picking up this lens or not, hopefully this video has been some kind of help for you making that decision. If you do like this video, please hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for other gear reviews, film tutorials, and as always, you guys, we'll catch you on the next one. Later.